Okay, now we've got this middle mount part right here, and there's plenty of room in here to fit the batteries when we have to. This is nice and solid. We follow the manual, and the main part of the frame is just about ready to go. So the next step, what we're going to do is move on to this step 3 bag here, which actually has your main gear and your auto tail gear. Let's see. Bust out scissors here. So this looks like it's about ready to go. We're going to make sure we check it and everything is nice and smooth. Make sure that the Loctite is in here the way it's supposed to be. Make sure everything is compliant with the manual. But it looks like this auto rotation main gear setup is already pretty much taken care of. What we're going to do next is, now we have all of the servo mount hardware right here. So we're going to get this stuff out, and we're going to start mounting the servos. This little collar here for the main shaft is, we're going to put this to the side. Oddly enough, it's going to go in underneath the top bearing block instead of over the top, like what some of you might be used to. It's going to go underneath, kind of like a Compass helicopter. It's going to go underneath the bearing. It'll give you more play with the swash plate. Get that handled. So we're going to take our servos and make sure we just mount them according to the manual. We're going to use the previously mounted servo mounts that are on here, carbon fiber, little front plates, and we're driving into plastics, so we're going to just use a little bit of CA if we want. I'm going to opt out of using CA out of these because we're using self-tapping screws. It's pretty good. We want a little bit of shock absorption in the servos. I'm not going to use the little metal inserts that go into the servos. I'm just going to use the little plastic parts that go in there. And we're going to make sure on the left side of the helicopter, both of the cyclic servos are facing upwards, but on the left side, this front servo is going to be facing towards the rear, but on the right side, the tail servo is going to be facing towards the front. So on the right side of the helicopter, right here, we're going to make sure that the rotating part of the servo is on the top for the cyclic, and on the front on the right side. And then on the left side, same thing with the cyclic, it's going to be on the top, but it's going to be on the back over here. Actually, that's that's actually just for the nitro. So we're not going to have to worry about this. This is throttle servo. We've got our elevator's going to be back here, 2 cyclic, and then tail servo here in the front. If you're running a nitro, this one you're going to want to make sure it's in the back, but we're not doing that, so we're just going to get those servos mounted here, and then we'll come back and look at those. We want to be geared towards running all the wires towards the front of the helicopter. And if you look at the manual for the elevator servo, we're going to put it back on the right side, and we're going to have the rotating part facing forward. So we'll come back and review once we get all the servos set up, and we'll get to setting up the one-way bearing after that. Okay, now while we can, one thing we're going to do real quick is use one of the supplied straps and run it through this front part, because eventually when we have to put a gyro or receiver or whatever we're going to put on here, it's going to be a little bit harder to access it once we put the servos on. So we're just going to get this thing pulled back and set up right here so that we can have that set up for when we need it in the future. Okay, now that we've got the servos mounted in here the way they're supposed to be. On the right side of the frame, again, cyclics are up, tail faces forward. Left side of the frame, there is no throttle servo because we're doing an electric, not a nitro. And the other cyclic is facing up again. For the elevator servo back here, you're going to use the plastic mount, and this time you're coming in, the servo comes in from the inside, and you come in with the screws from the outside, but you're screwing into the long part of the plastic is going to end up going into the little rubber grommets that are inside the servo. As you can see here in the manual, it shows you up here the long portion of the plastic servo mount tab goes down inside the servo rubber grommets. So these little tabs inside the holes, the carbon fiber little frames are going to be coming in from the outside, servos in from the center of the frame, and make sure you have the rotation part facing forward. And in the end, it looks like this. Little detailed view of how it's supposed to look. So you should have the servos all lined up, ready to go. Next part, I checked the main gear and the auto rotation. Everything was great. There was thread lock in here. All the bearings and everything was in there the way it's supposed to be. This part is ready to go out of the factory. As they instructed in the manual, take this little Jesus bolt. This is a pretty nice thick little Jesus bolt. Need like a 3mm screw to get it in there. And we're getting this thing all ready to go. Okay, one thing you want to make sure that you do with the main gear is get these 5 screws, the 3x6 cap screws, put into the main gear, and you want to make sure you're coming from the bottom and screwing into the top. You're putting thread lock and you're going through plastic, and then you're going to end metal to metal, so you're putting some blue thread lock on here. A good way to access it, just the way you have it, you can line up these squares so that you have access to the holes right here. You want to just make sure you line them up, and in the end they're going to just come about flush with the top here, and it all moves nice and smooth. In the next step, this part was already done by the factory. This part done by the factory. So we've got it set up like so up here. We're going to get ready to put it in here and put the main shaft down the top. What we're going to have to make sure we do is get the collar ready. Like I said earlier, this collar is going to go in from the bottom and come up from the third bearing, and we're going to make sure we have this 3x10 little cap screw holding that in place. And right now we're just going to leave it loose so we can slide it on the collar, but once we've got it ready, we're going to make sure we secure it here in the frame. And once it's inside here, there's a little hole. What's great about these little Rave kits is there's holes that you can access everything you need to access. So when we tighten the collar screw, we're going to come in from this hole here. There's also on the main shaft, when you're coming in, there's a hole here. So you know, you bring it with the 2 holes coming in, but then this lines up with this center hole, so you can put a little hex driver through it so it can hold it in place while you screw this bottom part. It's really nice and convenient. There's even holes here on the elevator arms, see in the frame and the elevator arms, so that you can make sure you can put something in there and hold it in place to make sure that you're measuring everything correctly. So these holes definitely help with getting everything lined up the way you want it to be lined up. So now that we've got the main gear ready to go and the auto rotation, we're going to put the main shaft in there, and we're going to line up the holes. We're going to make sure the collar is in here, and the indentation, the raised part of the collar, is going to go up towards the bearing. Usually if there's an indent on something like this, that's going to go towards the bearing. With this kit, it's going to go, you know, towards the bearing. so it can only equal the size of the smaller bearing, not the larger bearing, and when it spins around, it spins freely. So yeah, we're going to follow this here in the manual. Make sure we slide the main shaft down the way it recommends with the holes facing down. Line up the holes with this hole inside the frame, and then we're going to use a hex driver to hold it in place while we screw the Jesus bolt here on the bottom. And then we'll just have the main shaft sticking out with the main gear and everything, and it should be all set to go. Make sure you don't forget the collar. Remember, this collar is on the inside. You're going to hold the collar in there, slide the main shaft down in through the collar, in through the bottom bearing block. We'll get the Jesus bolt solidified, and then hold the collar up while we're pushing the main shaft down, and then we're going to tighten it through the hole on the frame. And make sure you just look at the recommendations on the manual, do exactly what it says, and you'll be good to go. Now we're ready to just put it into the main frame with the shaft coming through. Make sure again you put the collar in there, and that you're coming through the top third bearing, then the collar, then the second bearing, then through this main gear, and then the final bearing. And then we're going to screw the Jesus bolt through here, and make sure that we can get this little washer nut to stay in place right here, because when we screw through with the Jesus bolt, we might knock it out of place. So make sure once you get it through a little bit, hold it and then screw it in and get it nice and firm. Don't over tighten it, and you don't want to warp it. And then you might find that there's a little bit of up and down play here. The whole system, once you have it in the shaft, shouldn't be moving up and down, but here in the main gear you might find just a little bit of up and down play. That's normal. Don't worry about it. It shouldn't be a problem. See how just that little shaft in there moves just a little bit, but not too bad. Okay, here we go. Finished product. We've got the servos in. We've got the main gear here. It's moving nice and smooth. There's a little bit of up and down play here, like I told you, but that's not anything to worry about. We've got the Jesus bolt through. Once we get the Jesus bolt through, we're going to push down on the top. See, what I did was push down here, look from the back, and then with my finger in this hole here, I held the collar up. So I was able to give it like, let's see if I can get it on the camera here, like a nice little pinch, holding the collar up while I looked from the back and went in the side here in this hole and tightened this little collar screw. So we've got the collar in there, and when we were pushing down on this and pushing up on the collar, we made it so that there's no up and down play here on the main shaft. So there we go. Everything's moving nice and smooth, as it should. It's great. Just move it through here. The auto rotation drive just moves so smooth all by itself. So there we go. We've got the main frame with the main shaft and the main gear and all the servos, and we're ready to move on to the next step here on the electric build of the Rave ENV. Okay, next step we're going to move on to here is bag. It says step 4. It's got the swash plate, and you can set it up either in the 120 degree CCPM swash plate or the 140. I'm going to use the 120 myself, so just make sure that you set it up the way it says here. We've got the smaller ball links here on the ends, and then we've got the one here that's got another anti-rotation shaft sticking out here. There's also these little grub screws that come with the bag. You don't want to tighten them too much. They're meant for, you can tighten them if you get a bunch of play in your swash plate or your ball in here. But with a new one, you shouldn't have a lot of play. You just get it in there and just get it snug. You don't want it to be too tight, or you're going to kill your play or your smoothness there in the swash plate. So make sure you follow whichever setup you're going to go with, and remember, read this note that about the grub screw here, so that you do not fly with the set screw too tight on the swash plate. So we're going to go back, we're going to put thread lock on these and get the swash plate ready to go, and then we'll come back and show you what we've got. Now we've got the swash plate finished and ready to go. Blue thread lock. Got the small ones on there because we're doing the 120 ccpm. I opened up this bearing a little bit and put some extra tri-flow inside there. Make sure it's moving nice and smooth. Grub screws just in there lightly. Little blue thread lock, and just get them nice and loose. There's no play in here, so there's no reason to tighten them. If you ever tighten them, you're going to get into trouble. Next thing it says to do in the manual is to get this ball link, this linkage rod, ready to go. I'm going to make sure I follow the directions here and get it so that the gap in between is 48 millimeters and it's 90 millimeters between the holes. I notice there's a right angle turn, and there's a certain way that the balls clip on, or the ball linkage rods clip onto the ball links. There's a little dot here, as you'll see on the inside of the ball link. You probably can't see this one, but right here, a little raised and embossed dot, and that's going to be the part that goes inside. So we're going to create this one, measure it to length, and put it on the anti-rotation bracket part of the linkage rod. A good way to get this done is, just thread it in there a little bit, get it started. Your ball link pliers are pretty good for holding it in place. Get the second one on here. These fit on pretty nice. And then this little tool, if you've got it, is a great little thing for helping you put the linkage rods together. So just doing this until I get it to the size that I want it to be, and then I'm going to put it on this as it says in the manual, and then we'll come back and update and put this onto the main shaft and show you what it looks like when we're all set. Okay, now we have the swash plate done, and we put it in here inside the anti-rotation bracket. We've got this linkage rod measured to size. We're not going to put it in yet because I notice moving up and down here it's a little rough moving inside the anti-rotation bracket. So I'm going to take the bracket off, and I'm going to sand down in here. Make sure you use a nice straight flat sander so that you get it nice and straight. You might be able to just kind of work it up and down to get it to move smooth enough for you, but that's not smooth enough for me. You don't want to create any play, but you want to sand it enough so it's moving up and down nice and smooth. For mine, towards the top, it's better, but once it gets towards the bottom, it kind of clamps down on there and it snags. So I'm going to take this anti-rotation bracket off here and sand this down a little bit so it's a little smoother. But before we put the swash plate on here, I made sure I lubed up the main shaft, and that moves nice and smooth on there by itself. So we're going to come back after we sand this thing down. If you do it on the frame, you'll probably get fibers all over. I don't want to do that, so I'm going to just untighten or loosen up these screws, pull the whole thing off, and then sand in there. Again, make sure you use a nice straight flat sander and you don't over sand. You just want to make it so that the anti-rotation shaft is moving inside the guide nice and smooth. Okay, now we've shaved down this little space here in the anti-rotation bracket. It took quite a bit of shaving to get it down, but take your time. Make sure you're doing it nice and straight. Shave a little bit, test it out. Shave a little bit, test it out. Now we're going to put the swash plate on the main shaft. Just put it on here like so. This part facing up with these ball links, ball link ends, and then this ball linkage rod. We're going to want to make sure we push it down inside this little gap here as we slide it down, because that's going to link onto the elevator arm. And then what I like to do is push the swash plate forward as much as it can, and then you've got a little bit of space in the anti-rotation bracket. And testing it out, it moves nice and smooth. It's going to be nice and silky smooth the way we want it, all the way up and all the way down, and there's no play. So we sanded it down perfectly, and we're going to make sure this linkage rod down in here connects onto the elevator arm. Make sure that you set it up so that the dot on the linkage rod was facing to the left, so that when you click it onto this long linkage ball here, that the correct part is clicking on there. So you just, if you need to double check, you can probably push the linkage through this little arm, or this little hole here, for, you know, if you wanted to put the elevator servo on the left side. Ball is on the left here, the way it's supposed to be. So I'm just going to press fit it onto the ball link end here, down here, and use my ball link pliers to put it on there. The opposite way that you would use it to put it on, or to take it off, you can use it to put it on. So just press this in here, and we got the linkage ball on. So now that's moving the elevator arm inside there as it goes up and down. Again, everything's nice and smooth, so that's perfect. That's just the way we want it. And the swash plate is on there, and that part is ready to go. Now we'll start working on the rest of the mechanics for the head. Okay, next bag we're going to open up here is the one that says Flybar. It's got all the materials and hardware and stuff that you need to start building up the rest of the head and the Flybar system. And it's got the grips and all the thrust bearings and everything for the head, the linkage balls, the dampeners, Flybar setup, the button, the feathering shaft, washers, all these swash mix arms, everything that you need, all the paddles. So everything is in here. The next step we're going to start doing is the mixing arms. So we're going to go and refer to the manual on that part, and we'll see what we got next here. Okay, for the next step we're going to want to open up the package and pull out the little plastic mixing arm sections, and 2 of the regular bearings, and then 2 of the flanged bearings. And then you'll see in the package there's also 1 spacer that's a little bit thicker than all the other ones. Make sure you use that one. A small 2x10 millimeter screw and another M2 plastic nut washer. So basically what we're doing is this part up here, as you can see, we're going to start putting this bearing into this arm, then the spacer, then the other bearing, then we'll have that one ready to go, and then we'll put the flanges on this little part, and then put that on here, and then start screwing this 2x14 millimeter screw in here, and then we're going to tighten it into this nut right here. But we don't want to over tighten it. We just want to tighten it until it's just about flush and that everything is moving nice and smooth. And it's going into one of the nuts where you don't need to secure it with thread lock, so no thread lock in this. In the end, we want it to look just like this. I say just line everything up the way it looks here, and just set it up with the same perspective as it is in the manual. So you'll see there's like a flat side here in the manual. You see the left side, which is this part, longer edge out, shorter edge from the center here. Gonna do just like it says. Put the bearing in there, then get the spacer worked in there. Make sure it's in there properly. And then this other bearing. that part's set. Put the little flange bearings on this, and then just like in the manual, it's going to be dipping, this part's going to be going down to the right while this is faced up this way. Put it on here, and we're going to screw it on there with the nut, and then in the end you want to make sure it's moving nice and smooth. You're going to end up putting together 2 of these, and then once those are ready, we'll move on to the next step and put these onto the slider. Okay, moving on, now that we have both of these mixing arms ready to go, and they're moving nice and smooth, just the way we want, didn't over tighten that, we're going to grab the washout base here. If you're having a hard time finding it, my washout base was actually already on the head unit here, so pull that off there. You'll notice this thing, it isn't symmetrical. At first glance it may look like it, but there's actually one spot where there's more space here than there is up at the top. So the more length is actually on the bottom. And what you want to do is, just like previously, line it up just the same way that it looks in the manual. Have this facing here, and then the mixing arm is going to be facing just the way you set it up. There's also this little spacer, don't forget this spacer, the 3 by 4.5 by 0.5. There was 4 of them in my kit, so make sure you grab that, and the 3 by 12 cap screw, and you're going to use thread lock because you're going metal into metal. So we've got our screws and our little spacers. So we're going to make sure, just the way we put this thing together, we're going to hold it right here like this, and make sure the length of your part is on the bottom. Thread lock on the end of this, make sure you don't get any thread lock in the bearings, just get it in the threads nice and smooth, and then through the spacer, through the mixing arm, and into the washout base. Do that on both sides, and then we'll come back and put the washout base onto the frame. Okay, now we've got the washout base with the mixing arms on here, all ready to go. Make sure, again, everything's moving nice and smooth. You got some thread lock on these, going metal into metal, get it nice and tight. Don't kill it, you don't want to kill anything by over tightening. You know, over tightening too many screws can just create nothing but problems for you. You want things to move smooth, let the thread lock do its work, give it overnight to sit before you try to fly it, and you'll be good to go. Next thing, all you have to do here is just put the washout base, make sure the lengthiest part is facing down. Put it on here, and you're just going to snap 2 of these onto the swash plate. They're all equal length, so it doesn't matter which 2, as long as it's the 2, you know, across from each other. Just snap it on here, and that's going to move up and down nice and smooth. The whole thing is nice and smooth. That's exactly what you want. So now we're going to move on to the next part of putting the head together here. Okay, moving on to the next part, we're going to start building like the head block, and this whole setup. You're going to need a couple really big 5mm hex wrenches, and then pull out these 2 big thick 5 by I believe 12mm screws, your head block, your 2 head grips, and all your thrust bearings, dampeners. What you want to make sure you do, I just like to line it up in the order that it's going to be going in there. We've got here the dampeners. These are going to go inside the head block, and you want to make sure that the part that goes inside is the part that doesn't have the embossed raised edge, because there's one side that's, you know, you can see it's a little bit raised, and then the other side isn't. You want to make sure the raised part is facing the outside, just like it says here in the manual. So we've got the dampener, we've got this large inner diameter little washer, and what you want to do is with these ball races, there's going to be 2 of them that have a larger inner diameter. You can see when you put it on the feathering shaft that there's a lot more play. that one's going to go on the inside, okay? And then this other one with the smaller inner diameter, you can see when you put it on here, there's barely any play at all. That one goes towards the outside. So larger inner diameter is going to go on the inside. Make sure, you know, the curved part, the ball race, is facing the outside towards where the bearings are. And what we're going to do is, with the open face, we're going to pack that with grease. We're going to get whatever kind of grease you need or prefer to pack it in there. Fill the inside here with grease, and then the open face goes towards the inside. It's going to go towards the center of the head block. And so the part that is actually covered is going towards the outside. Why do we do this? When we pack this with grease, it's going to be swinging around, and the centrifugal force is going to try to push the grease out. And if you have it with the open face facing towards the outside, then the grease is just going to fly out through the rest of it, and it's not going to stay in there very long. You want to make sure the open face is inside. So follow the manual, make sure you do that. And then there's also this two-step little washer thing right here that's going to go in there. So I'm going to start putting these parts on one side. Make sure you use thread lock. Get plenty of thread lock on here. Some people choose to use red on one side. I'm just going to use blue on both sides. Make sure it's on there. Get it nice and tight. These are 5mm. You're going to have to try pretty hard, and you don't want your blades or grips coming out. So make sure you get these nice and tight, and you're following the order exactly as it describes in the manual up here. And you want to get everything nice and smooth. If you have your ball races messed up, you might have some notchy feeling once you have a load on it, and you don't want that. Make sure larger outer diameter is towards the inside. So we're going to put that together and then come show how smooth it is and do a little update. One thing to know is the bearings are already inside of the grips, those little ones. So if you didn't see them in here, that's because they were already packed inside the grips. See, I get one side ready right here. I've got the thrust bearings, the inner diameter, and I'm just going to put it inside the grip. Get everything lined up, slide it in there, put the dampener on it, put this on the head, and then start getting the other side ready and pack the other side, and then tighten the two of them with the head in the center. And again, make sure that the embedded part is towards the outside with the dampener. Another quick tip for when you're putting the head together, a little tri-flow on the feathering shaft. Never hurts to get everything going in there and moving nice and smooth. And we haven't put the ball link ends on the bearings or on the main grips yet, so this is nice and flat down here, so you can actually just kind of set it down, and when you're putting your parts in there, you can just, you know, drop them in here and get everything ready to go so that you can put the second grip onto the head. So we're going to put this on some thread lock on the end here, and then we're going to put the head completely together, make sure it's smooth, make sure it's nice and tight, and then we'll come show you. Another little tip on the head block, just make sure you put the dampeners in there first. I tried kind of lining it up and then putting it in as I'd put the heads in, but they weren't going in the way they should, so just get the dampeners in there nice and tight first. Make sure that it's flush, and again, make sure that the grommet part that sticks out is towards the outside. And there's also this little washer here that you're going to want to make sure that you put between the dampener and the grips. So once you've got one side ready to go, just make sure you put the dampener on, or this spacer in here, and then put a little tri-flow on the end when you run it in. Run this end through. It's going to take a second here. See, so This is going to come through. The dampener on the other side is going to probably want to come out. So make sure you push this down, get it all the way through, then push the dampener down, and then make sure you get this other little spacer on before you start putting the second head grip on the head. Okay, so here's the finished product with the head block. Everything's nice and tight. There's no extra room or play, and everything's moving nice and smooth. Okay, that's just the way you want it. We cranked in both sides really tight, and we want to make sure we don't forget the bearing in here in between the grips, and then or the washer spacer in between the grips, the bearings inside here, the large inner diameter, the ball races, and then the little step washer here, and then the 5mm hex screw. Just make sure you're following exactly what it says here, and you've got the correct order. So now we're going to move on to the metal mixing arms. We're going to get these set up. There's another one of these little spacers here that we're going to put in here with the bearings, and short arm, longer arm. We're going to make sure that we screw the balls on the part that is protruding, because there's one side that's going to be flat, one side that's going to have the protruding parts, and get this thing ready so that we can start getting the Flybar and all that stuff ready to go. Okay, for this Flybar seesaw assembly, this part is already pretty much done for you. It's already set up. Most of this page 54 and 55, all this is done. I checked. This has thread lock. I pulled mine out, put some more thread lock on them, but out of the factory they're already ready to go. The washer was here, the spacer, the washer, all the bearings were in place the way they were supposed to be. All I really had to do was put on the balls for the ball links. So I just make sure I put those on the correct side. Open this up, make sure they're facing towards the inside, and the rest of it is already ready to go, nice and smooth, and the seesaw is all set. So we're going to move on to the next set, or the next step in the manual. Okay, next step here, we're going to put this seesaw for the Flybar onto the head block. We're going to make sure we line it up the way it is looking here. I'm not going to put these blade screws in here yet. I'm going to just put those to the side. I don't really need to put those in there yet. We're going to make sure, see how we've got the shorter part of the arm down here, longer part out here, and it's the side where the screw in is towards you. The rest of it's basically symmetrical, so which side is on the top doesn't really matter. We're going to pull out these two little screws here, these shank seesaw screws, and we're going to apply red thread lock onto those, the really tight type 22, really tight stuff. So make sure we get out these two screws here, and you've got your type 22, and we're going to put that on there. Make sure when you set it up, just make it look the way it looks in the manual, and put the seesaw on here, line up the holes, and then run these in, and you're going to end up screwing these into these little tapped metal pieces right here, and that's going to be on there nice and tight. It's not going to be going anywhere. Just make sure you don't get any of the thread lock inside any of the bearings that you're going to be screwing into. So we'll come back and we'll look at that once we've got the seesaw on the head. Okay, now we've got the seesaw on there. It's again moving nice and smooth. Everything's nice and smooth the way you want it. Last part we're going to do here for the head, or the next part, is get the button head on here. I've got a 3x8 screw here that's all thread locked and ready to go because we're going metal into metal, and it only really kind of fits on there one way. Just make sure you line this up instead of going like this and then trying to tighten it. It will be a little difficult for you. It's keyed, so it only really goes on there one way, and then we'll screw that on the top, and then we'll start moving on to the rest of the Flybar setup. Okay, now for the next part we're going to put together these Flybar links. Now you have to be extra careful at this time and make sure you're taking it easy and doing it correctly. And it's going to be a bit of a pain trying to get this little screw inside of here. It's gonna there's a little hole in there. Most of it kind of plays around, but then you have to line it up with the hole in there, and you're gonna have to put on a lot of pressure to push that on there. And what you want to do is make sure you get this all the way to the bottom of this part first before you start putting on the small ball link on the end here. If you try to put it on the link and then screw it on there, chances are you're probably going to screw too far into the link and break it. So make sure you don't do that and break the link. Screw all the way in here. What I did, use the ball link pliers and the little end part, hold it on there, and I just pushed and twisted and finally got it on there. By the time you have it ready to put the small ball link on, just a little bit of that little thread is going to be sticking out the top. That's how you want it, and then you're going to start screwing it in there, and then the end of the ball link is going to start screwing inside here. And just make sure you get this all the way in here before you start putting the ball link on there, or you'll ruin the ball link. And then bring out your calipers. Make sure the whole thing is 90 millimeters, or between the center holes of the ball links it's 81.5. And you want to make sure it's facing the right direction. And then we're just going to put a steel control ball on here so that later we can just screw it on to the rest of the head assembly. So we'll come back once we've got these Flybar arms ready to go. Okay, now we got the Flybar arms put together and ready to go. I had to get these things as tight as I could, just as tight as you can without breaking them, just to get them to length. And they might even be a slight, like half a millimeter, you know, or a millimeter too small, or you know, I was basically able to make sure that the 81.5 measured between the center of the balls, but it seemed a little bit more than 90 for the whole thing. But I can't screw it anymore, or I'm going to bust these things or compromise the integrity of them. So I got these both to the same length, and make sure as you look up here, as it's facing you, you have the ball links lined up correctly. The holes are basically in the same direction, and you're going to put this little ball end onto this little linkage right here, and you're going to make sure that the protruding side of the ball link is facing the same direction as the little protrusion on the link. So protrusion here, same way as it goes out. This part's going to be flat, and it's going to go straight down. So make sure you set up that correctly, and it's exactly as it describes here in the manual. So now that that part's done, we're going to go and move on to the next part and start getting the rest of the Flybar put together. Okay, so next step, we're going to get these Flybar link assemblies and the Flybar cage balls all set up to put together the Flybar cage. We're going to put the Flybar links on, make sure that the protruding part of the L goes on this certain direction, and there's little fibers on the back part. That's the front part is the way that you slide onto the Flybar cage ball rod. Okay, you want to make sure you slide on there correctly, and we're going to make it like this, and then we're going to start screwing in the other parts of the cage, and have these 2.5 by 10. It's actually a 2 millimeter by 10. I think 2 millimeters is the hex driver that you're using to screw in here. And we're going to make this little L part right here. Once we make the little L and we've got it all set up correctly, we're going to make a second L, and then we're going to put them together with the Flybar and use the Flybar to guide it on, and then put the whole Flybar cage together. So you want to make sure that you slide these on the correct way. This part coming in, just gonna get through this part here, and then you just want to snap it on here. This actually becomes a little bit easier. You can use your ball link pliers, and you can just snap it on here like this. Okay, so once that's snapped on, you've got that looking good. And then you've got this part here. I've got this screw already pre-thread locked. You're going metal into metal, so again, put thread lock in it. Put that in here, and we're going to screw it into the side that has the link towards it. So back here, we're just going to make this little L shape, and then once we screw that on there, we're going to have this full L, and then we're going to make a second one and start putting them in the Flybar cage. So I'm going to get this one done, finish up the second L, and get the rest of it ready to put on the head block. And make sure that you don't forget to use the thread lock in here. Okay, now moving along into the building of the Flybar cage. I've taken the Flybar out of the case where it is with the boom, and I've put it in here inside the seesaw. It moves nice and smooth. There's a couple notches. We're not going to worry about that too much, but get it about centered the way we want it. And then we're going to start sliding on the cage and putting that onto the Flybar. Make sure the dimple is facing the inside, all of the protrusions are facing the inside. Put that on that side, and then on the other side we're going to put the other part of the L so that these meet up, and then use my little screws to screw in here, again making sure we're using thread lock. I'm sure you guys are tired of hearing that by now. So we're going to put those in there and finish this up, and then we'll start taking a little measurement 38 millimeters out, and then I'm going to just mark it here, and we'll start putting the Flybar paddles on there and use a little bit of CA to hold it in place just for the last little twist. So I'm going to finish this Flybar cage and then that part set up, and then we'll be putting on the paddles next. Okay, next part here for the head. We're going to make sure we line up the notches inside these holes and put our grub screws in. You can do one at a time. Just line up, make sure you can still see it in one, hold it, and then make sure you put thread lock on the grub screw, and then tighten the grub screw on here on one side to make sure that you're hitting the notch. And then on the other side, go in and put that grub screw in there. And then once you've got the grub screws on and it's nice and tight, you start putting the Flybar paddles on. I made sure on the end, I just went and I measured out 38 millimeters, and we're going to put the Flybar paddle onto the rod about that far. So I put just a little mark. You can put tape on there and then take that off, or if you don't mind putting a little mark on there. And as I started threading it in, I'm going to put a little bit of CA just on the last couple threads, and then tighten that whole thing, and then make sure that the distance here is equal to the distance here. They have to be equal, and then you want to measure them out so that they're level with the cage. So we'll put the second Flybar on here and measure everything out, make sure it's level with the cage, and then come and update and show you how everything looks when it's about ready to go onto the frame. Here we go. Now we've got the Flybar paddles on here as we wanted them. This measures exactly the same length as on the other side, and you can use a pitch gauge if you need for assistance, but you just want to make sure that the paddle ends up level with the cage here, and on both sides paddle level with the cage. Leading edge is going to go clockwise, so you want to make sure that the leading edge of it is going to be facing the correct direction. Just make sure it matches up with what it says in the manual. So this is all good. Grub screws are on here nice and tight. If they're not tight, then when you're making your final adjustments on the paddles, it may move a little bit and you may be going back and forth making your adjustments. So make sure that you get those grub screws nice and tight on there, or those set screws. So last thing I'm going to do for this head is on the grips. I have not yet put these ball link parts on the end. So I'm going to do that, put some thread lock on them, and put them on the inner hole because I'm doing the Flybar version. The outer hole is for the Flybar-less if you're going to do that. So we're going to put those on there, and then we'll get ready to put this on the frame. Okay, one little thing about these grip ball links. It doesn't screw directly into the grip like it looks like in the manual. It's actually these little black nuts that come with the whole kit on this package. You're going to be screwing it in here, and you're going to slide the nut. There's a little slot here you can see on the grip. Slide the nut in there and pull that back. Make sure you put thread lock on there, and then twist it in there, and then use some needle nose pliers or something to tighten it, and then you'll have it in there all set. Okay, now we're going to put the head onto the main frame part. First we got to make sure we've got our Jesus bolt, and we've got our little 3x10s that we're going to use to put on the collar. We'll show you that will go on these parts. Jesus bolt's going to come through here, and then we've got these little 2x10 millimeter screws with these little M2 washers. We're going to use those as well to put these little ball links, these Flybar ball links, onto the mixing arms. So first thing we want to do is make sure we line up the holes. So we got the hole here on the head block. We're going to line that up with the hole on the main shaft. And then we're going to take our Jesus bolt, put it through here. I'm just going to lift it just a little, put it through, and then we've got one of these nice little plastic washers, so we don't need to use any thread lock. We're going to put that in there. Right now I'm just going to finger tighten it. When I cut, I'm going to tighten that a little bit more with a wrench and then get it hand tight. In the meantime, I'm going to put these little bolts in here on the collar as well, hand tightened. Same on both sides. Same on the second side. And then what we're going to do here with these ball link ends is take the little 2mm by 10mm, and then we're going to put through these little washers here. Make sure we get the right size hex screw. Screw that in, and remember how we put the ball link on the ends of this Flybar rod earlier? We're going to now use this, put this through here, and then screw this into the long end. Make sure you've got the washout base matched up with the phasing pins, and we're going to screw this in here. And if you want, you can put a little bit of CA on the end there. I'm not going to do that right now. It's long enough. You don't want to over tighten it. You want to make sure you get it nice and snug. Don't over tighten it anything into plastic, or it'll be just too much. And then do the same thing on the second arm here, or ball link arm for the seesaw cage. And once we've got those tightened, we can come in here and tighten the Jesus bolt, and then tighten those 3x10mm that are going into the collar of the head block. Okay, so we'll come and review after we've got those parts finished up. Okay, so there we have it. The head block now is securely fastened onto the rest of the head and the frame. The phasing pins and the washout base are matching up perfectly. The swash plate moves smooth through the whole thing. All the grips move smooth. We got this last little these collar screws in here. Make sure you tighten them evenly. Kind of go to one, tighten a little bit, other one, tighten a little, go back and forth. make sure they're tightened nice and evenly. Jesus bolt is in here and screwed in, and the head is ready to go. Now we can start kind of moving on to the tail, and we'll get the ball links finished up for the head here a little bit later. Okay, now the next section we're going to move on to is step 5. We're going to start putting the tail components together. So we're going to want to open this bag, get everything out, and let's open it up here and show you what all is inside. Looks like we've got just about everything we need, and some of the stuff looks like it's already actually even pre-done. So far everything that's been pre-done in the factory has been thread locked and perfect the way it should be. Here we've got zip ties and the frame brace and the guides for the push rod. The tail block looks like that's already got the torque tube in it the way it should be. Stabilizer, mount, the fin, blades, back torque tubes, all the gearing, tail pitch slider, control arm, the tail shaft and hub. We've also got this bag full of bearings. We've got thrust bearings for this, so the tail's going to move nice and smooth. Love for thrust bearings on the tail. And we've got these two little metal parts for the front and the back. So we're going to open this stuff up and then start moving into, I believe, step 5.1 into the manual. Okay, now that we're moving on to setting up the tail, step 5. Over here, step 5.1. This whole page is already done for you out of the factory. These guys are already ready to go. They've got all the bearings and spacers and everything's in there the way it should be. Same with down here. They put together the tail pitch slider and everything you need, and it's all set to go out of the factory. It's got the thread lock where it needs it. Got this tail pitch slider all ready. Gonna put that to the side, and we also have the torque tube components. Looks like these are symmetrical, so the one that goes in the front is the same as the one that goes in the back. So we're going to put that to the side. What we have here lined up is the rear tail hub and all of the different bearings and spacers and washers and nuts and bolts that we're going to be using to set this up. The way we do this one is we're going to put everything on here on the end of the hub, and then put the nut on the end, and then take the grips and clamp them on to that whole assembly, and then screw those together. It's going to be like a little sandwich thing. So here on the next page you can see it says all the details, just like on the main blade grip, except this time the bearings aren't preloaded into any grips. So you've got the bearing. Make sure you've got the right spacer here. It's a little thicker than all the other ones, so it's easy to tell apart. 1 millimeter, it's like 7 by 10 by 1. Make sure you've got all the correct diameters. The larger inner diameter is the one that's going to go towards the inside. Remember, just like we did with the main blade grip, put it on here and you'll see it's loose, where the one with the smaller inner diameter won't be as loose on the hub. So we've got the bearing, spacer, larger inner diameter. We're going to pack the balls or the bearings here with grease, small inner diameter, and then make sure you get the right washer here, the 4 by 7 by 0.5. There's a couple washers that look like they may be similar, so get out your calipers and measure the inner and outer diameter. Make sure you've got the 4 by 7 and it's 0.5. Then a bearing, and then the washer. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 components. Got it lined up here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So what I'm going to do is pack this bearing, double check, make sure that this is the one that's going to be going inside. See how it's a little bit loose? And this one is going to be towards the outside. See how it's not loose at all? And then again, the open face of the bearing is going to go towards the inside of the hub, because we're going to pack it with grease and we don't want the grease to fly out. And then these nuts, they've got plastic in them, so you don't have to actually use any thread lock. So we're going to get that set up, and then we'll come and put the blade grips on there. You know that we have this tail hub all set up and ready to go with all the bearings on it. Everything's nice and smooth. We're going to separate. We've got these plastic blade grips. We've got these 8 little, I think 8 by 2 millimeter screws. A bunch of these little black anodized hex bolts. 2 more ball links and 2 more little screws to get the ball links on here. So what we're going to do is, you'll see 2 of them have little ends and 2 of them don't. Make sure you don't put the 2 with the same ends together. But basically you're just going to sandwich these together like so, and one side you can see holds the hex nuts, and then you put the hex nuts in there. Put some thread lock on here because they don't have plastic on them, so it's metal into metal. Thread lock on the bolts, and then all the way around. You do all 4, just get them nice and loose to start out, and then start tightening them, you know, diagonal and then in star formation. And you're into plastic, so you don't want to push it too much. You know, let the thread lock do its job. If you clamp on it too hard, you know, you're just clamping on plastic, and you're going to start causing cracks, and it's going to create nothing but problems for you. So make sure you don't do it too hard. And then after that, you're going to put the ball links on the end of here and use a little bit of CA to put that in there, because you're just going metal into plastic. Do that on both sides, and then you'll have your whole tail grip and hub set up and ready to go. And we'll come back and update and show you once we've got that all finished. Okay, now we've got the tail grips all set up and ready. Make sure you don't go too tight, but you use thread lock going into these again. We've got the ball links here on the end, and I use a little bit of CA. Next we're going to put the blades on. You're going to make sure that the leading edge of the blades is going to go on the side that's opposite of the ball links. So it's going to be facing this way, not this way, in this way. Okay, so it's going to be spinning counterclockwise. So make sure the leading edge is going to be going forward, and that the ball links will be following the leading edge, just like it says in the books. So pull out these longer 3x14 screws and the M3 nuts. And again, you don't have to use thread lock on these ones because it's got the little plastic in there. And put the blade grips on there, and then you've got that whole section set up and ready to go. Alright, next part we're going to move on to now is getting this little tail bell crank assembly put together. So we're going to make sure we pull out this part, the little carbon fiber tail rotor bell crank plate, and these flange bearings would already be in this little setup. This was screwed to something, but take it off what it's on. You're going to have to do that to put it together anyways. These little pin screws here, there's going to be 2 of those. Make sure you get a couple of 3x8 cap screws. That's going to go in here and screw it together, and in the end it's going to look like this. So here you can see we've got all the little pieces that we need. Also, we're going to have this little linkage ball here on the bottom, so make sure you set that up correctly. It's going to come through. We've got the hex nut. There's going to be the washer on the inside of that part, and the screw is going to go through there. So make sure you've got, you know, the hex bolt, the ball link, the screw, the washer. This part was on it, and we removed it. We'll put that on there later. We've got this little carbon fiber arm. This are little 3x8 screws. Anytime you're going into metal, make sure you use thread lock, and thread lock also on these little pin screws. And the pin screws, you know, go in the top. Carbon fiber plate comes down here. Just align it the same way that it's set up in the manual, like so, and then screw that together, and then put together the ball on the end there, and then we'll come and update once we've got that part finished. Okay, we've got this little tail bell crank all done and ready to go. We've got these pins sticking out here. Got the ball on the end there. There's the washer in there, thread locked onto the nuts, and these guys in here holding it together. Next we're going to open up the case that has all the torque tube stuff. Basically all the long stuff is in the same package. We've got the support rods. We're going to put those to the side for now. We've got the boom. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have the next D facing towards the front. Both sides look identical to me, so you could really put it towards the back, but I'm going to have it facing towards the front. Looks better that way. We've got the rod for the tail pitch slider. The rest of it, another little rod that's going to go to the side of the frame that's going to control the tail and go onto that little lever. These little torque tube gears and the torque tube itself, what we're going to do is we're going to end up putting these in here, but first we're going to get the bearings onto the torque tube, but then after that we're going to put these here on the end and use a couple of screws that we have in the kit. It's just threaded out on the end, and it's another 12. It's a 2x12 millimeter, and then a couple little lock nuts that we're going to use to hold those in place. But first, what we're going to do is get the bearings on the torque tube. First one is going to be 200 millimeters out, and then the next one I'm going to measure 250 millimeters. So I'm going to go measure that and come back and show you how to glue it on there. We want to make sure that when we glue the bearings on there, we get a nice thin layer of CA around here, and then we push it on and we don't get any glue inside the bearings, and I'll show you that here in just a second. Okay, with the torque tube, we've measured out the 250 millimeters from here. The other one's 200, like we said earlier. This one we've already got glued on here. So once we've taken the measurement, I've put a little mark on here. What we're going to do is put a little bit of CA glue on there, just a little thin strip all the way around, and then we're going to use our finger to kind of rotate it and get it to be a nice thin layer. You know, if it's too thick, then you can end up causing it to get inside the bearing, and you don't want that. So once you've got it nice and thin, you can put the bearing on and slide it down in here and kind of rock it on that spot, or you just put the CA. Won't want to move. Okay, so it's nice and solid on there. You want to make sure it's moving great. Okay, now that that's done, we can put some grease on the little plastic parts and put them over the bearings, and then slide this into the torque tube and start building up the rest of it. But we got to make sure before we do that, now that we've got the bearings on here, we're going to put the torque tube gears here in the end. Before we put them in, it says in the manual, let's see here. So yes, we already did the 200 millimeters, 250. Use glue, applied a thin layer of CA to get those on here. Then we're going to put these little rubber torque tube bearing supports. Just push those over here, and you might need to use some grease on the outside when you're putting it into the torque tube, but you should be able to slide it over the bearing without any problems. If you need to use grease, that's fine too. Over here, use red thread lock on this whole thing. Red thread lock on the inside of here. We don't want it moving. Slide it in here, line up the holes, make sure you use the 2x12 shank screw and the M2 lock nut, and get it in there. You want to tighten it nice and securely, but you don't want to over tighten this. You can cause a lot of problems. If you over tighten this, you can end up seeing a broken torque tube during your flight later on, and you don't want that. So we're going to put these on here, and again, make sure you use red thread lock and that you don't over tighten these too much. Okay, so now we've got the torque tube ready to go inside the tail boom. Make sure what's the easiest way to do this is to put the glue on, put the bearing on from one side, we'll say here from left to right, and then put the bearing support, the rubber bearing support on after that, and make sure you come in from the same direction that you came towards the glue. If you come the opposite direction, you can probably end up breaking loose from the CA glue. And then put the second bearing on, and then put the second bearing support. Otherwise, you can also put the bearing inside the bearing support and then put those on here. Just make sure, you know, like I said, get the correct distances, and then after that put the little torque tube ends on here the way they're supposed to be. So this is the finished product. We've got it all done, ready to go. 250 millimeters distance here, 200 millimeters, and it's ready to go inside of the torque tube. I also suggest, if you came at it from one way with the bearings in this way and then in this way, then when you go into the torque tube, come in this way so that all the pressure is also pushing everything that direction towards where most of the glue is, and then that way you don't have things breaking free. Also, little grease in here and in the end of the torque tube is great to get it sliding in there nice and smooth. So we're going to go ahead and put this inside the torque tube and start building the rest of the tail. Another thing that we're going to want to put together is these little rods for the tail pitch, or the tail pitch slider rods. Has these little guides. There's 4 of them. Make sure we've got a large circle on one side, small circle on the other side. Make sure the small circle is on all the same sides, and the same with the large circle. And then we're going to put the boom through here, and make sure we've got all these little tail rod guides in place before we put together both sides of the tail boom. Otherwise, if we put it all together and we don't have these in place, it's going to be a real pain to have to go back and put it in there. Okay, just to update and show you where we're at, I got all these little tail rod supports on here. They're all facing the correct direction, and just kind of loosely put the ball links. We're going to use long. We got long and short ball link ends, so we put the long ones on here on the end, and we're going to size those up a little bit later, and we put the torque tube here inside of the boom. It moves pretty smooth. You don't even have to use any grease really to get it moving in there. So that's all ready to go. Next thing we're going to do is start putting together the rest of the parts for the tail. Next thing it asks you to do is put this little unit on here. The protruding part faces towards the boom. This is going to be what we're putting together, is the tail gear base, which is the rear of the helicopter, and then we're going to put this little torque tube assembly in here, the torque tube gear assembly inside here, and then we'll come out with this at the end and come back and update again and start building the fin and the rest of the tail gear box. Okay, here's what we've got now. Tail boom has this gear in it. Make sure that when you put all this stuff together, you're lining up the holes, of course. Move that in place. And this one only really goes in there one way, so when you push it in there all the way, the holes will be lined up. And this is, I ended up just pushing the torque tube into this so it's moving along with that. Next we're going to take the other part of the tail gear with the tail shaft and follow the next part of the instructions. Flange bearing is already in the tail fin here, so we're going to push this in here and use a 3x8 to hold this little tail gear spacer, and then we'll end up with this little part that has these 2 parts screwed into it, and then we're going to use a couple 3x8 screws to screw it onto. We're going to have to come in from the left side and screw it onto the back. So just like it says in here, wrong side. The larger side, see the larger diameter flange here, smaller we're going to come in from that side. And with this, we've got this little part coming here with the 3x8. Screw this in here. And then once we've got this whole thing put together, we're going to come in the side of this. Make sure you've got the correct side. I actually had the wrong side, so I'm going to move this little part so I've got it correct. Line it up with the holes. Alright, so once it's lined up with the holes, we're going to come in, make sure the gear mesh is straight. What we're going to do here is make sure the mesh is straight, and in the end, if it's not, we can go back. There's a couple shims provided in the kit that we can put in the back here or on other sides if we have to. But right now it looks like the mesh is going to be okay, but we're going to follow along and then we'll come back and show the next step once we've got this stuff set up on the tail. Okay, now I've got this thing together and I've got these bolts fairly tight, not completely, but tight enough. I haven't like hand cranked them all the way, but enough to know that that's not where it's moving. And now I'm checking right here, and there's a little bit of extra play, in the gear mesh, and I don't really want that, so I'm going to use one of the spacers that they've got to make it come out a little bit and make sure it's a little closer. If you have it too close, it won't be good. You don't want it to be, too much play there, but too close and it's not gonna be right either. So, you just want the right amount. So I think I'm just use one of the really thin shims to get that on there correctly, so that I don't have all that play in there. And then I'll come back, I'll get this perfect, and then we'll move on to the next step. Okay, now we've got it all set. I realized that my shims were actually the bigger outer diameter ones, and I'm going to need them over here. So once we've got the shims on there that we need, you may or may not need them yourself. You're going to grab this other little carbon fiber part, and this is going to go on the tail. It's another little flanged bearing. So the largest part, the largest outer diameter, is going to go towards the inside, just like with the fin. So outer diameter towards the outside. So make sure you slide this on here exactly how you're supposed to. And then on the right side, we're going to make sure we use this little part, and we use some 10mm screws to screw through here, and we're going into metal, so thread lock, and then an 8mm screw to screw in the back part, and then we'll have the tail case assembly basically put together right there. But just like it says in the manual, the flange bearing is already on, so yeah, 3x8 in the back and the 3x10 in the front. So just follow these, and then in the end you'll have this. Okay, we've got the tail gear assembly finished off, and just to top it off, once we've got these 10mm screws here, 8mm in the back, there's another little stainless steel socket head screw, 8mm. Put that in there, screw that in with thread lock because you're going metal into metal, and make sure you get that 10mm, it's a 3x10 screw in here, and with thread lock, get it nice and tight and secure. Don't kill it, clamp it down and give it, good tight fastening. But with any of these, you don't want to strip them and cause any problems and prevent you from being able to remove this stuff later on when you have to. So there we go with that. Okay, moving on to the next part, we are going to put this little rear bell crank on here, and then we're going to put the tail pitch slider on, and as we put it on, we're going to make sure we engage the pins into the little slider ring as we put that on. So again, some thread lock onto some 3x8 millimeter. We just screw into this. Not gonna get that tight just yet. Screw into the top for now. And then make sure we apply a little bit of Tri-Flow or some sort of oil onto the shaft, just a nice thin layer of that oil. Get that in there before we put the tail pitch slider on it, and make sure the arms are facing towards the outside, and put the slider on there and engage the pins as you slide it down, just like that. Okay, so once it's on there, once we get everything tightened, it should be nice and loose, and then we can loosen up the pins a little bit if we have to, if it's too loose, and then we'll get it so it's sliding on nice and smooth. So for now, this is what it looks like. We'll get everything tightened, and then we'll come back and show you the next part. Okay, now we've adjusted the tail pitch slider. It wasn't moving very smooth. I went and flipped this little metal piece around like this, and now it's a little more smooth. Loosen this up, and if you get this too tight, it also won't be smooth. You might be able to use some spacers if you have a little bit of play in there, but I was able to get it all tightened pretty well, and it's moving nice and smooth. Clicked it on my ball link. That's exactly what you want. You know, you want everything moving smooth. If anything's binding or if it's hard and tough, then you're going to have issues, so just make sure it's nice like that. And what we're going to do next now is put the tail fins on to finish up this part. You know, just check out the manual, make sure you do it correctly. There's a couple of 4x4 grub screws, a couple little indentations here. You can see indentations, and you're going to want to line that up with the holes when you put this on here, and then you use the grub screws with some thread lock on here, and make sure the leading edge is set up so that it goes counterclockwise. It's going to go this way, so make sure that the edge of the blade is in the front and that the ball links are in the back. So I'm going to go get the grub screws, put them on there, and then we're going to tighten the tail pitch slider. Just push it onto the ball links here, and then we'll pretty much have the tail set up and ready to go. Okay, here we go. The tail gear assembly is finished. We've got the 2 set screws done. We've got the ball links all set. There's a little indentation on one side. Make sure you get that nice and tight and go, and then get the other side. Again, don't forget to use thread lock. You're going into metal. And make sure, you know, everything's still moving nice and smooth. So there we go with that. We can now move on to the next step. Okay, the next step here, part 514, is pretty much already done for you. The block that ends up holding the front of the tail boom and that whole setup. The bearings are in there, the torque tube gears are in there. If you have some play in your setup, then there's also, you know, some washers that you could use to get rid of that play, but mine was perfect the way it was set up. Nothing's moving up or down. You're going to have to open it up so that you can get the tail boom in there. Also, the other part, the other torque tube, put in the front the same way you put it in the back. Line up the holes. It really only goes in there one way. and slide it in there, and then once it's in, you can clamp this shut, and then you've got this whole thing set up to put the necessary screws in the side here and make sure all of this is secure, and then you can start putting it in the frame. And then there's a bunch of these 3x8 screws that are going to be going into the frame, into these little hex bolts, which are already placed in there conveniently for us. So you're, again, metal into metal, you know what to do. There's 12 of them, 6 on each side. We'll come back once we've got this thing finished and put together, and we'll show you putting it into the frame. Okay, now I've got the whole tail assembly completely set up and ready to go. I've got these little stainless steel button head screws to put in here, and make sure, you know, as you're putting it on, you're lining up the holes, because it's the second hole on here that this is going to end up screwing into. If you're screwing into it and you find that these blocks are just separating, then you're probably not lined up with the hole. You got to make sure you're lined up with the hole and hold it nice and tight when you screw it. When it starts kind of compressing more when you're screwing it in, you know you're screwing it into the right place. Also on the other side, there's 2 of these. This is basically doing the whole pinning of the boom. 2 sides. Looks really good, holds nice and strong. This is ready to go. I'm not going to put it on the frame yet. Right now I'm going to just put it to the side, and we'll put it on the frame later after I finish up putting together the servos and all that stuff here, because for me it's actually just going to be a little bit simpler to go through and get all the servo stuff finished up. So I'll be moving on to that part next, and we're actually done with the tail for now. Okay, getting to the servos and setting up the radio. I'm not going to go too in-depth on the radio setup. I'm using a DX7, and it's a 120 ccpm setup, and that's pretty simple and straightforward. This build is kind of more about the helicopter. If you want to see a video on setting up a DX7, I did one on an Align. Basic, simple, same concepts. And if you need to learn about radio programming, you can see on my channel how to set up a DX7, which is what I'm going to be doing with this one. Right now I'm just going to talk about what I'll be doing here on all of the servos. It mentions, when it comes time to setting up the servos, the arms on the elevators are going to be about 13.5 millimeters out. Make sure you're doing that correctly, that you're hooking up to the receiver the way you're supposed to, that your gyro and your rudder are all set up correctly. If you have any questions, I have some videos on how to do an Align, a Spartan, and a Mini G gyro on my channel. Just make sure that you've got the speed matched for your rudder servo before you plug it in, or you might end up damaging your rudder servo. Just measure all the linkages out to the lengths that it requires. For the servo horns, we're going to be screwing the balls, and it'll be having the balls facing the inside, the part that you're going to be putting on the servo. So when you put it on, the ball links are going to be inside towards the servo. Same with the elevator servo. Just make sure you're measuring up to the specs on the linkage rods, and you do that all the way around. You're using your calipers, you're making sure everything measures correctly, that these little things are level and even, and everything at 50-50 is exactly the way it's supposed to be. One thing that's really convenient about this helicopter when it comes to radio setup, there's these holes here. See if I can zoom in on it. There's these holes here on the arms, and what you can do is put a hex screw through them to line it up, and then that way you know that's how you're 50-50 or 90 degrees. You know, you want to make sure that when you're 50-50 on your radio, everything's 90 degrees, you know, the basic setup. But there's also, you know, these holes that can hold things in place to help guide you along the way. So I'm going to do the radio setup, and then I'll come back and update and show you the frame before I put the boom in, and we'll just make sure, you know, the swash plate is moving the way we want it to, and everything is working as expected. So go ahead and set up your radio. If you have any specific questions, go ahead and put it on my channel. But this is pretty simple and straightforward. It's about measuring ball links to size. We're going to measure the ball links up here on the top to the specifications that it requires for the head. There's a couple more, you know, ball links that we need up here, linkage rods to finish up the head, and the complete swash plate and mixing arms. So we're going to just do that as well. So this is the fun part. It'll take a little bit of time, but it's pretty simple and straightforward. Okay, now I've got all the radio gear set up the way it's supposed to be, and all the linkages on the top and everything. Just for that step, make sure for the top we measured out this one with 5.6 millimeters in between. Whole thing is 33. That goes to the blade grip and the Flybar cage seesaw mixing arm. And then you measure this one out here. It's the longest rod, and it's going to be 75 millimeters in the middle, 118 between the two holes, and that goes right here on the longest section down to the swash plate. So that finishes up the head. Once you set up all your stuff in your radio, again, make sure you know what you're doing, and you want to make sure, like I said, you've got these ball links set up correctly. I'll show you the finished product here, but we got to talk about something real quick. Let's see, like I said, the ailerons, those servos are going to be a good little 90 degrees, and you're going to be able to utilize this hole here in the aileron arm, put a little driver through, and you can use that to hold it into place. You just want to use that hole to try to look through if you're adding a little sub trim or something, just to make sure it's lined up, and then to double check it, put it through. Don't put the hex driver through and then try to turn on your radio when it's not set up correctly yet, because then you might overdrive your servo and create some problems for yourself. Measured out this little tail control rod with this carbon piece. Made sure we use some long ball links on there. Okay, let's see, next one. Right here. Now this is what you have to be aware of. I put my mixing arm in a spot where it was supposed to be set up for the 140 degree, but I'm doing 120, so I had to move this, and now it's on the third hole, which is closest to this big hole here, instead of the hole that's closest to the center of the frame. And that means that bracket there, I ended up using 3x8 to hold the bottom part of that brace that we put in there, and then we moved and we ended up using these M3 plastic locking nuts on the mixing arm to hold those in place. So because I'm doing the 120 setup, I had to move my arms. Make sure you know which one of these three holes that you're going to want to go into. Actually, there's only the two, the front and the back, for the 120 and the 120 CCPM. So for the 120, you measure out these long rods. You're going to end up building 4 of them with the 70.5. I am doing the 120 CCPM, so this is my setup right here. This aileron mixing arm right here is going to be on, like I said, this hole that's closest to the front. I measured out 4 of these 34.5 millimeter, put them on the front and the back. I kind of had to back it out one turn for each side to make sure that my servos weren't buzzing horribly when I put them on there. They still buzz a little bit, but nothing too bad. And then you measure out 2 more of these with the 53 millimeters to control the swash plate. Once you've got everything leveled and you've got your servo set up, and then you put it on there and do all your swash reversing and your swash mix and everything you need to. For the aileron servo, 120 and 140, it's going to be the same. You're going to have a long ball link and a short ball link, and you're going to put them together on the short little threaded part, and make sure there's no gap there in between the small and the large. It'll be basically about to size. And I didn't have any problems with my lengths over there. Then finally, take this thing out. Still got the electronics need wired a little bit. And then I also added this little rod that goes to the tail. You want to make sure in the back that when it's centered, that this little thing is nice little 90 degrees set up right there. And then when we put the tail boom on, we'll click it on here and have control of the tail. So, you know, same setup as most helicopters. 90-degree angles are your friend. You want to make sure that the swash plate is level. If you have to do some trimming or whatever you got to do to make sure it's level, just make sure that is perfectly level and you've got 90 degrees all the way around. You know, everything's nice and level. I had to adjust the links. I had to go out one on this one and then two turns on the longer one to make sure that my grips were nice and level at 50-50. And it's also set up so that as the swash plate goes down, the pitch goes up. And as the swash plate goes up, the pitch goes down. So if you're used to the swash plate going up to give you positive pitch, this is the opposite. Make sure you know what you're doing so that when you're giving plus on the throttle, that the swash plate is going down and you're getting positive pitch. That's what you want. One more thing to be aware of: when I was checking out my swash plate and my aileron, I had a zip tie in this hole down here that I was using to hold the elevator servo wire, and the end of the zip tie was actually getting hit by this ball link, and it was keeping my aileron from going completely to the right. So make sure you don't have any pieces sticking out here, like from zip ties or anything that's going to cause any mechanical issues or anything's binding or connecting. So watch out for that little those 2 zip tie holes, and make sure it's not hitting your arm as it's going down. So same as usual. Swash plate, move forward when you want to go forward, back, left, right on the aileron, doing exactly what you want. So now we got the frame set up. Everything's in the radio, everything's level, everything's perfect. We got 90 degrees, and we're ready to put the tail on the frame and move on. Okay, now that we've got all the radio stuff set up, we're going to now put the tail onto the main frame and turn it into a whole helicopter at this point. So make sure we've got, you know, all 12 of these 3x8 cap screws. We've put thread lock on them. All of the hex bolts are in here. Make sure none of them slipped out. We're going to slide it in there. There's a couple holes on the frame. You can see it lines up. Make sure you just get it in there, line it up with the holes, make sure that the gears are together, tighten both sides, get it a little loose to start out, and then go back and start cross tightening all of the bolts after that. And then when you're done, you'll have the completed setup right here. So I'm going to get my screws ready, pre-threaded. I'll put this in here, and we'll come back and update and start putting on the boom supports. Right now we have the boom on the frame, and we've got all of the screws nice and tight, just like it says up here. Moved on to the next part, putting the guides in the correct spots. It says right here you're supposed to measure them out 100 millimeters, 175, 175, and then 150 with the gap in between them. So what I did, use my calipers 100. It didn't go out too far on my calipers, so I just went another 100, and then I slid the guide over here, and then went an extra 75, and then slid it back out. And then I had 75, so I went 75, opened it up to 100, and then slid it back out. So I had the 175 total, and then did the same thing here, 100, and then an extra 50, and then got them lined up perfectly. Before you do that, you can put the little 2x6mm screws in there, in the guides. Make sure you come into the side that has the gap. One of mine did not want to tighten enough to clamp it down, so I used a little bit of CA to get it to stay in place. It was pretty tight, but not as tight as I wanted it, and then it wasn't going in any further. So the rest of mine did fine. Measured those out, and then what I did was I tightened these ball links on the tail push rod pretty tight. I had to go, about as tight as all the other linkages. Just tighten it, make sure you've got it set up so that when it's at 90 degrees here on this little slider, that the tail is basically, right here in the middle of the slider. Depending on your gyro, it might want some different configurations, but middle of the slider and 90 degrees right here is what you want. So that's what we've got here. That's set up, did lots of tightening on this to make sure it was right, and then measured these out. These are tight now, and they're all in the exact locations that we want them. These little guides. Also, look from underneath, make sure it's straight, and look from the rear of the helicopter and look down the boom and make sure those are as straight as you can get them. Get these guys all lined up and make sure you can do a 90 degree look here with the bell crank arm, and then it goes just straight out, and then it comes straight out of this part as well at 90 degrees. So that's the helicopter with the tail on. Now we will finally go and put together the support rods. Put these on here. It shows in the manual how to put these together, but as you can see, they are already put together in the factory. So we will put on those rods, use this part to put on the stabilizer, and then we have the carbon stabilizer plus a couple spacers and extra little carbon supports that we're going to be using as well. So get all that stuff together, and we'll come and look at how to put those on. Alright, now we're going to put together the rest of all of the tail hardware. So you want to get all this stuff together. We've got this last little M3 nut, 2 little spacers here. We've got like 6 of these M3 washers, the stabilizer mount, all the carbon stabilizers, extra frame supports. I'm actually going to have to pull 2 screws out on the bottom that I've already placed in there to get those in place. The screws that are going to go here, but it'll be worth it for the extra frame support. And then the tail boom support stuff right there, and we'll show how to put all this stuff together. There's also 3 of these 3x10 washers. Make sure you clean them out. What we're going to do is put the horizontal fin clamp here, this metal part, and then the horizontal fin. Use some 3x10 cap screws with thread lock in there, and we're just going to kind of have it loose right now so we can slide it and adjust it once we put the support rods on there. Support rods are done and ready to go. Next part, we've pulled out these little spacers. There's some washers here, so there's 2 there. There's a couple washers that are going to go into the back of the support rods, and then a couple washers that are going to go into this little part that ends up supporting the tail boom supports. And they're all held in by 3x8s. So exactly what we're going to do, follow along here. After we get the horizontal support fin on there, make sure we've got the washers in place. So it's going to be a 3x18 cap screw here. It's a pretty long one there in the kit. Screw in here, washer through the tail boom support, hit the spacer, and I'm also going to make sure I put the frame support, that little extra piece of carbon right here. While I'm in the process, I'm going to put that in place. So once we've got that, we do that on both sides, and then we'll come and we'll show how to get this little thing on here. Okay, now we've got all the tail boom supports on here. Okay, now we've got all the tail boom supports on here. This little extra frame brace, this carbon fiber piece, made sure I pulled all these bolts out. For holding this part back here, remember when we cut the little plastic frame brace for the middle part down here? Well, the other half of it we're going to use in between here. It says in the manual just to use a little hex thing, but I put it in the plastic because I had it. Adds a little extra rigidity to it. So run that 18mm screw, make sure you go through the washer, and then through the boom support, and then through this little spacer right here. And then through the spacer, you're going into this brace that you still got left over. So yeah, do that on both sides. And then on the back of the helicopter, we have the horizontal stabilizer. We've got a 10mm. Again, we ran that in here through the washer. Get it nice and tight. Don't forget thread lock. And then for the stabilizer, you don't want to over crank it. Don't strong arm it and end up compressing your boom. You can create problems that way. So I just look down the bottom, make sure it's level with everything else, and then just kind of go back and forth and tighten it. And once you've got that together, now we can move on to this little part that we're going to put on the boom. Okay, now for this part right here, what you do is you just sandwich the little pieces together. Make sure you use the washers when you go in there. Come in with the 3x10, use the washer on the other side. You don't need thread lock because you've got an M3 nut right here. And you're going to have it loose to start out, so it's kind of going in and out. We're going to put it here on the boom. Whoops. Okay, so it slides in and out here. So what we're going to do is put it here on the boom. Start down low, because that's where you can get it in. And start moving it up. I like to have it about here. And then if it's nice and loose, you can kind of get it to where, you know, you stretch it out and you can clamp it nice and firm onto the supports. And then once you've got it where you need it, you can tighten this, hold the screw, or use a needle nose plier to hold the nut and get it nice and tight. And then you're going to run zip ties all the way around. There's little holes, you run zip tie in there, 2 on each side, and then get it nice and firm so that it's holding the boom supports in place. Okay, now here we have the finished product. Most of the main part of the frame is now completely done. We've got all the tail boom supports, all the supports for the rods, all the fins, we've got the tail on, we've got all the servos mounted, everything's set up, the head is ready to go. Next thing I'm just going to do is route all my wires. I got to get my wires routed, and then I'll come and show you what I'm going to do there. For the servos, it's pretty simple. I'm running everything towards the front. I'm going to put my gyro up here on this little flat spot, program my gyro, run my receiver in here. There's another spot in here where I'll hold my receiver. The elevator servo, I ran through this little hole that we put the little grommet in. We didn't have a grommet for these parts because it's not a nitro. We're not going to be running any tubing through there. So run it through there inside the frame, and then to the front is how I've got everything coming. So I'm going to get everything lined up and strapped down and make sure all the wires are are good and they're not going to end up rubbing against the frame or anything. And then we'll come back and look at that, and then after that we can start building the canopy, and we're getting a bit closer here to the finish line. Okay, now we've almost got the frame completely finished. We've got all the tail boom supports on here, all the supports and the guides for the tail push rod. Everything's 90 degrees as it should be on the tail, on the head. The frame is pretty much finished and put together, and everything is looking good. Now we're going to move on to getting the motor and everything set up, and getting the ESC and everything put where we want to put it, and then we'll move on to wiring. So next we're going to start moving on to the motor electronics and talk about the specifics of what you're going to be doing there for an electric setup. Okay, now we're going to talk about the motor mounting and everything for the electric setup. It's kind of a clever little setup here. You've got this little part, we've got an M3 lock nut washer, and we're going to put that in here because that's going to end up connecting with this unit here. You may think that your pinion was too long, but don't worry, it's not. Once these two clamp together, your pinion's going to be just the perfect size. So you're going to put this in here and use an M3 washer in here with a 3x10 screw, and we're going to screw that in there to put this part together. But first I want to show you something with the motor. Depending on the motor you have, different motors have different size shafts, and if your shaft is between 21 and 33 millimeters long, what you're going to have to do is take the shaft out and get to a lathe and cut the shaft down to 21 millimeters. If we look at the motor I have here, my shaft comes out to 35 millimeters, so well over 33. So I definitely don't have to worry about that. If it's shorter than 33, what you're going to have to do is, see this little thing, this pinion here, you're going to put that in with the washer, and then you're going to put that through the bearing in this part, and you'll have this little piece sticking out. And then what you're going to do is, when you put the pinion on, the shaft is going to end up meeting up with this part, and the 21 millimeters will fill this part. But since mine is long enough, I don't need this part. I can pull this out because the end of the shaft will end up going long enough so that it can go in there. So make sure you know the length of your shaft and whether or not you're going to have to use this little piece right here. But you are going to have to make sure you use this washer. So just like it says in the manual, I'm going to put this together, and then we'll start putting the pinion on there. You've got these long screws to hold it in place. Make sure you use thread lock. There's also these spacers if your shaft is too long or the pinion is too long and you need an extra spacer. They've got these here that you can use as well. So we're going to put that all together, and we'll come and show the motor mount setup once we've got it all put together. Alright, so I'll show you the final motor mount configuration here. I ended up having, there's a space in between here, so I ended up using just one of these little spacers. That's all I needed to use for this configuration. And the screws provided went through, and they're not going down too far. Everything's moving nice and smooth, so that worked out. Make sure you've got your washer in there. It says to make this part in the center of this whole thing, so I looked inside and I was able to see, that they were lined up in the center, and then tighten this guy with the M3 lock nut, and make sure everything's moving nice and free. Make sure your shaft is going through here, and again, if your shaft is too short, you may have to cut it to 21 millimeters and use this little extra pinion piece. So there we are, we're ready to go. You also want to make sure you run the wires towards the back of where the face is, because the face is going to be towards the gear, so this will all go towards the front where everything is at. So This is all ready to go inside the helicopter, and we'll come back and show how to mount this. Okay, I've gone and got my my ESC programmed. I'm using a Castle Creations HV120. Got it all programmed. Got my endpoints ready to go. It's all set up. It's mounted on here still, like we said. Next thing it says in the manual, you're going to want to slide the motor in here and line it up with these holes here on the bottom. You can see here, we're going to end up having it like this, but there's it's a little bit slotted, so you can move it forward and back for gear mesh. We're also using 3x10 screws with some M3 washers. So make sure you have your screws and your washers ready in there. They've got their thread lock on them. This motor mount slides in here nice and smooth. So you don't even have to separate the frames or anything. Just make sure you're not getting in the way of any of your wires or anything. It's machined just perfectly. It slides in there, and there's still no play. So yeah, this is machined perfectly. It slides in there. You can get it in there. Just make sure you don't hit any of the wires. Yeah, it gets nice and level, and then just get in there, get the gear mesh the way you want it to be, line it up with the holes, and then slide it forward and back and make sure the gear mesh is what you want it to be. What I'm going to do is put a little piece of paper in here and then push it as hard as I can and then tighten it, and then move it and get the piece of paper out, because that's usually the best way to get the perfect gear mesh. So I'm going to do that, get the motor mounted in here, and then come and show you how it's looking when we're all finished. And then once we've got that all done, we can start getting all the electronics organized. Okay, now we've got the motor mounted in here. We've got the mesh set up exactly how we wanted it. You know, made our sheet of paper. You didn't even have to hold it in when you put the motor in. You could just put it in, set it nice and loose, and then cut a piece of paper to the right size, and then just feed it in there, and then feed it through, and then tighten it up, and get the mesh nice and perfect. Check it out, make sure everything's moving mechanically as it's supposed to. I ended up also running most of my wires up here to the front. Pretty simple setup. It didn't take too much work. I put my receiver here on the right on this little flat spot. My gyro up here. Going to put my ESC right here. We'll see. I might end up moving it over here. We're going to kind of check it out, what happens with the batteries, and how easy it is for me to access that stuff. So we're just about done. We've got this whole frame together. Motor's mounted. Mesh is perfect. Head is set up. Tail is on. Tail is perfect. I've got the gyro programmed, and if you've got any questions on programming the gyro, I've got how to program a couple of them. I've got a Spartan in a line and a Mini G done on my channel. One thing that you'll notice with the tail, since it's it's trailing edge with the ball links, so just make sure you notice that the leading edge of the blades is going the opposite way that the slider's going. If you're used to a T-Rex, you might see that it's the opposite of what you're used to. So pay attention to which edge is the leading edge and which edge is the trailing edge, and know how to do your tail setup. It will go towards the direction of the leading edge. So make sure you set up your gyro correctly and you've got all that set perfectly. So now we will go to getting this nice little canopy set up. I'm going to go pull out all the parts, and it's pretty simple. We're just going to put a little grommet in here, and then there's a little part that slides in here, and a little part in here. So we'll go get that stuff together and get the canopy together, and finish this up. Okay, here's what we're going to do with the canopy. We've got all the hardware here. The washers and the 3x8 screws are going to be to hold the canopy on when that comes. We've got these smaller, thinner, hard plastic parts, and then the rubber grommets. And then we've also got these other two little U-shaped rubber grommets. So what we're going to do is put these little plastic ones on here, but we're going to use CA, a little bit of super glue, put those in place, let them dry, and we've got one here, one on the other side, and one on the bottom. So we're going to put those three parts on there, and then once we've got those on there, then we're going to put these rubber grommets on. This is always kind of a tricky part. It's a bit of a pain. You kind of got to get one side in there and try to get as much as you can through, and then slowly work it through and pull it out the other end. It's all about just kind of working it in slowly, and it's never a piece of cake, but that's the way to do it. And then these little U-shape are going to go on the bottom part here. You're going to get them glued on there nice and tight, and they're going to make sure that it doesn't rub up against the main shaft or the main frame. What I've heard of some other people doing is there's also where the standoffs are inside of here, putting like a little piece of glue or something for the spot where the little standoff rubs up against the canopy. Sometimes people put glue in those. So I'm going to see where that happens, and I might put glue in there. But for now, I'm just going to put these little parts on here. Follow what it says here on the manual. These little U-shaped parts right here. Make sure you use the CA plastic parts, then the rubber grommets. And in order to put it on the helicopter, we're going to use, without using thread lock, the M3 washer and a 3x8 cap screw when we put it on. And then we'll have almost the finished product. Okay, and here's the finished product of the canopy. We've got the grommet on there, grommet on here. I always like to put a little bit of tri-flow on them. It gets it on, for me, I think it helps the life of the grommet a little bit. Got it in there, got it in there. So, canopy's all finished up, pretty easy. We're going to put it on the model and show how it looks. Okay, here we go. Final product here. Got the canopy on, even got some batteries in there. They mount perfectly. Stretching it out. Got these nice stick banger Curtis Youngblood carbon fiber blades. And there we go. Finished product. Just for comparison, if you want to see it compared to the T-Rex 700, here we'll put them nose to nose. Here. Okay, line up the noses. Or even just lining up the blades. Yeah, the Rave goes a little bit longer, but it's also running 710s, where the T-Rex 600 is running 690s. So, there we go. End of the Rave ENV. Now, we just gotta go test it out. Tail's holding nice. Feels pretty smooth. Looks like the tracking on the blades is perfect. Might even want to go down on the gain a little bit. Really? Bump it into idle up. Holds pretty well. Got the elevator pretty sensitive. It's a little bit bouncy, almost like I have a 3-axis gyro with gain. Just taking it nice and easy. It does fly nice and smooth. Once you get going in the forward flight, it's on rails. Just like my Rave 450. We can handle a bit of a higher head speed. Some pitch changes. Pretty smooth if you ask me. Alright, it's good for a test flight. I'll leave it at that for now. Check all the screws, make sure everything's nice and tight, and I'll come and abuse it a little bit more later on, but pretty smooth. Not really much adjustments needed to be made. The tracking was perfect, trimming was pretty much perfect. Blade swing for quite some time. Rave ENV. Looking good.